Buenas tardes, señoras y señores. Es para nosotros un honor en Casa Árabe y en compañía del Foro Cultural de Austria en Madrid
to be together with the Austrian Cultural Forum here in Madrid to begin our conference of today. The title is European Powers and the Naissance of Weak States in the Arab Middle East after World War I. Dr. Gudrun Harrer, who is a journalist and an analyst on the Middle East, will be giving her speech. She is also an editor of the Austrian journal Der Standard. She is also a teacher of modern history and politics. She has been special envoy in Iraq on behalf of her country, and she's also the author of the book Dismantling the Iraqi Nuclear Program. In 2015, she received the prestigious award Bruno Prisky, recognizing her achievements in the field of human rights. We often say that it is an honor to welcome a guest. It is always an honor, but today it is a special honor to have this speaker and to carry out this activity within the framework of two types of events. On the one hand, we have events celebrating the beginning of the First World War. 3 days ago, the Gallipoli battle was commemorated. And on the other hand, today's conference is part of the cycle of analysis and description of the current situations in the Middle East, and more specifically, those situations regarding Iraq and Syria with the wrongly called Islamic State and other terrorist organizations. Therefore, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Gudrun Harrer, and I would also like to thank you all for being here, especially the ambassador of Austria, who has been working hard with us in the organization of this event. I would like to welcome also the ambassadors of Palestine, Iraq, and other countries who are here with us today. Without further ado, I give the floor to today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm also very grateful that you came in such big numbers. It's such a nice spring evening outside, and you are sitting here wanting to hear me. I'm really very honored. I speak about events, partly about events which happened 190 years ago, but I have to stress that I'm not a historian. I will repeat it also. I mean, my aim is to try to understand what's going on in the Middle East now. And I think we have to look into history too. This is what I am trying to do. By training, I'm a political scientist, not a historian. The year 2014 marked the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the First World War. In the Middle East, the commemoration of the Great War and its consequences falls into a very sensitive period of time, as you know. The region is witnessing what could be exactly the breakdown of the order which was established by the European powers after 1918. Two of the states, which have been created from the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, Syria and Iraq, lie in shambles, or their borders do. Their borders partly don't exist anymore, the Iraqi-Syrian border. The national states, which for decades were held under the tight control of strong regimes and were considered strong national states, have shown a striking lack of resilience and poor sustainability as those regimes were gone, like Saddam Hussein's in Iraq, or grew weak, like in Syria. They have proven to be highly vulnerable, and their futures as unified states in the borders given to them after World War I seems uncertain. My presentation deals with the question where this lack of resilience derives from. Naturally, I tell you now, there is no simple answer. The causes certainly are multiple, a mix of unfavorable preconditions and bad turns taken throughout the history of the 20th century. I will also try to identify some parallels between the past and the present, or rather the not so far past. This is not a historical presentation, as I said. It simply wants to provide food for thought about the genesis of the present precarious condition of the Middle East. The creation of Iraq and Syria was the result of the first large-scale modern Western military intervention in the region, the war of the Entente powers against the Ottoman Empire, and later also against local population, in disregard of the spirit of US President Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech of January 1918. In it, Wilson demanded respect for the interests of the populations concerned. As you know, nobody asked them, and the French had to crush a revolt in Syria to impose their will, the British in Iraq. I find interesting that the Arab Spring movements since 2011 by some were identified as a second Arab revolt, aiming at ending once and for all the post-colonial period by toppling the undemocratic regimes of the 20th century. In 2011, only the regimes were challenged and targeted. But a few years later, we see that also the state system itself comes under pressure. And today's disintegration, in my opinion, again started with a massive military intervention, with the invasion of Saddam Hussein's Iraq by the United States of America, together with some allies, including Europeans, in March 2003. The so-called Islamic State, Daesh, as I prefer to say, which had its beginning as Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004, can be called a paradox product, a paradox result of this intervention. And one should expect other paradox results of the present intervention against Daesh. There are some striking parallels between the British role in Iraq after 1917 and the US endeavors after 2003. Both UK and US, as you know, supported the claim of ending an unrightful oppression. As British General Stanley Maude declared after he entered Baghdad in 1917, he said, "Our armies do not come into your lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators." A few years later, in the capitals of both countries, in London and in Washington, after their interventions, political discussions followed about the wisdom of imperial overreach, costly adventures, and doubtful commitments. We cannot act alone as the policeman for the world. Who said it? I mean, you will say US politicians after 2003, but this is a quote of the opposition leader and later conservative British Prime Minister Bonar Law in 1922. And in both cases, in the 20s and after 2003, the former liberators tried to disengage and get rid of the burden without giving up their influence. In the Western media, but also in the Middle East, the Arab national states often are dubbed artificial, and the whole Arab statehood concept as artificial, unnatural. And for me, it's very interesting to hear that in a way we took over the Arab nationalist narrative. Arab nationalists, like for example Sati al-Husri, they were convinced that the European powers had carved up what was a cultural entity, and what was supposed to become a political one day. And today, the imposition of the state order after World War I sometimes is identified as the root cause of the weakness of the states overrun or threatened by Daesh. However, for me, it's hard to see what presumably more resilient, natural, and non-artificial states and borders should be exactly, drawn according to which criteria? Geographical, tribal, ethnic, religious? Do not many other successful states in the international system stem from war and conquest? Why should Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul, with old historical connection and ties, not fare well together? Do not the Arab states by now have their own separate histories during which their populations showed deep loyalty and attachment to their countries? Did not, as for example Adid Darwisha points out, even early Arab nationalist societies feel the strain of regional loyalties like Syrian or Iraqi? Undoubtedly, the denial of a big Arab nation state has been a festering wound for old Arab nationalists. However, it is questionable to claim that the denial condemned nation states like Syria and Iraq from the outset. I would rather prefer to call those states impeded or even prevented or aborted, or what happens today, disowned states. They were exogenously created, but this would not be enough for them to be doomed. There must be more. Also, after their creation, foreign interests and home-made bad policies interfered seriously with the will and the needs of their populations and prevented them growing together and develop national identities which are strong enough to sustainably transcend other identities and resist crises like the current ones. Nevertheless, in a presentation like mine, the conflicting British promises during World War I have to be mentioned, this is clear. The Oriental question, who would inherit the remains of the Ottoman Empire after its long-expected demise, was already discussed during the 19th century. During the war, it became a story of lies, betrayals, and misconceptions. Ironically enough, the British were not only playing double games, they were deceived too. They fell to the claim of a young Arab nationalist, Mohammed al-Farouqi, who succeeded in making them believe that a huge majority of Arab soldiers in the Ottoman army was ready to turn against their masters if an Arab revolt was proclaimed by Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca. Farouqi introduced himself to the British as the Sharif's confidant and to Sharif Hussein as the British friend. A great hoax, as David Fromkin called it in his book, A Peace to End All Peace. His exaggerations resulted into the Clayton Memorandum, which strongly recommended British policymakers to support Hussein in the belief that a powerful anti-Turkish organization existed behind enemy lines. In the Hussein-McMahon correspondence between July 1915 and January 1916, the British pledged their support of an Arab revolt against the Ottomans and outlined a future Sharifian government open to many different interpretations of what they really meant and which territories were included or excluded. One might identify another parallel between the British of that time and the Americans 90 years later. The bureaucratic and political fissures in both administrations. They led to conflicting statements and also domestically contested policy decisions. In the British case, this was a competition between the Arab Bureau in Cairo on one and the India office or the British government in India on the other hand, and the Foreign Office in London as a third party and other London offices. In the case of the US invasion of Iraq, it was a deep enmity between the State Department and the Pentagon, which resulted in the ousting of professional diplomacy from the Iraq file, and with it of a lot of Middle East expertise. In both cases, the divisions within the bureaucracy undermined attempts to build functioning states. After 2003, many Iraqis just could not believe that the poor results of reconstruction efforts were the consequence of the dysfunctional system of the occupier. And thus, the conspiracy theory started to flourish, claiming that the US wanted Iraq to fail, that the US wanted to keep Iraq weak. In 1915, Britain's India office was totally against, and the Foreign Office at least skeptical about the Arab office's plans to create an Arab Caliph, one of true race, as the Earl of Kitchener wrote, the Caliph in the person of the Hashemite Hussein bin Ali. The India office's man for the rule on the Arab Peninsula and for a partnership with the British was a certain Abdulaziz ibn Saud, who had for years written letters to the British without being listened to, and who finally became handy at the outset of the war to harass the Ottomans and their allies, for example, the House of Rashid in Hail. Abdulaziz ibn Saud suffered setbacks at the beginning, but later, as you well know, would expel the Hashemites from the Hijaz. Today, many identify the Wahhabi ideology, the 18th century Salafism of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, as the origin of the destructive radical jihadism embodied by Daesh. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, but many think it's the same ideology. Syria and Iraq have been mentioned as the states whose borders are crumbling. However, Daesh has its sights also on the two states of the before-mentioned dynasties, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, founded by one of the sons of Sharif Hussein, Abdullah, and Saudi Arabia, the state assembled by Ibn Saud and proclaimed kingdom in 1932. Both belong to the list of countries which Daesh sees as colonial creatures. And it's of a certain irony, let me say, that the historically difficult relationship between the Sauds and the Hashemites has never been better than just now. There were several reasons for the British Arab Bureau in Cairo to engage with the Arabs. Of course, the disaster of the then ongoing Battle of Gallipoli changed the British view of what the Ottoman Empire still could achieve militarily. Later, in 1916, also the Mesopotamian Expeditionary Force was in dire difficulties in Iraq after the defeat in Al-Qud. The British feared an Ottoman attack on the Suez Canal, and even more that such an attack could ignite an anti-British revolt in Egypt. The Ottoman Empire, of course, also had proclaimed the jihad, and also the Germans were eager to revolutionize the Muslims of the Middle East against the British. One other motive for a certain political sector in Britain, represented, for example, by the British liaison officer in the Arab camp, T.E. Lawrence, were anti-French sentiments. If the Arabs got Syria, the French would not get it. And this, as you well know, French-British competition in the Middle East lasted well until the Second World War. There are still different views on the question if the British support for Sharif Hussein at the end was a miscalculation. The military importance really can be disputed. But without doubt, the British alliance with the Arabs was at least a very important piece of war propaganda. But for sure, it was a political misunderstanding. What the British looked for at that time was a kind of Arab pope for the Muslims. And this was, by the way, also the wish of some pan-Islamists like Rashid Rida. Instead, with the Hashemite, they got an Arab politician and not a very successful one. And even if there was a big amount of Arab resentment against the Ottomans, and from a certain point in the history, the wish to get rid of them, or of their rule, this did not mean that the Arabs agreed to support altogether one of their own. The British, in the meantime, tried to square this circle and to reconcile their promises to the Arabs with their commitments towards their ally France. The diplomat and presumed Middle East expert Mark Sykes was tasked to negotiate the future frontiers of Syria with his French counterpart, François-Georges Picot. In the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the United Kingdom and France defined their future areas of control and influence. Originally, the deal also included the approval of the Russians, who themselves held old ambitions to get the fillet pieces of the Ottoman Empire, even Istanbul. No? The Russian plans, like attacking the Bosphorus, were never realized and therefore are rarely being recounted and evaluated. The outbreak of the revolution in Russia led also to the publication of the mutual Anglo-French commitments. Today, Sykes-Picot in the media is often quoted as a synonym for the borders which were drawn by the European powers between the new Arab states after the war. Of course, this is absolutely not correct. The agreement between Sykes and Georges-Picot, first of all, covered only the area between Palestine to Iraq. The projected zones of interest and control do not coincide with the later states. Sykes-Picot, in fact, was never implemented in the original of 1916. The most obvious example being Mosul, which was supposed to be in the French zone, but which France later gave up in exchange of British support regarding Alsace-Lorraine. It is also not correct that the borders which were drawn following the 1920 San Remo conference were totally made up. More often than not, they followed old Ottoman district boundaries. Between Sykes-Picot and the implementation of the actual state order, several important UK policy changes took place. And the British were also unhappy regarding their commitments towards the French. And a completely new system, the mandate system, was created. However, what's true is that Sykes-Picot does remain a document which illustrates the disregard of the European powers for the wishes and aspirations of their populations living in the Middle East. And as such, it has become a code of imperial power. This may not be academically correct, but it has a powerful historical influence. And even Daesh and other jihadist propagandists refer to it, and it will not have much effect to tell them that they got it all wrong academically. The third point, the Balfour Declaration of 1917. On the other hand, I mean, it appealed to some people there, but only to a then very small part of the population in the region. In it, the British Foreign Ministry, as you all know, of course, held out the prospect of the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, excluding anything, again a quote, which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. Also here, the background was quite clear: to encourage Jewish cooperation in Palestine. And this was not so difficult in the face of the policies of Ottoman governor Cemal Pasha towards the Jews, many of them citizens of enemy countries who feared the same fate as Armenians. And of course, the aim was also to win over the support of the international Zionist movement, which was supposed to have influence on the American government. However, we also should not forget that Germany, the war ally of the Ottoman Empire, was considered a particular friendly country by Jews. Completely different to the British allied Russia with its regular anti-Jewish pogroms. And regarding France, the Dreyfus affair was still not forgotten. And again, also the competition with the French played a role. If the UK would give Palestine to the Jews, the UK would exert control over the area and not France. The contradictoriness of the British promises to the Arabs and the Jews is well documented in a letter which the head of the Arab Bureau in Cairo, David Hogarth, had to deliver to Hussein in January 1918. Hussein at that time had already proclaimed himself king of Arab lands, but was recognized by the British only as king of Hijaz. Hogarth's account shows that the British knew well that not all commitments could be honored. He reported that Hussein, I quote, would not accept an independent Jewish state in Palestine, nor was I instructed to warn him that such a state was contemplated by Great Britain. A rare public acknowledgement in this regard came from British Foreign Minister Jack Straw 90 years later. I quote, "A lot of the problems we are having to deal with now, I have to deal with now, are a consequence of our colonial past. The Balfour Declaration and the contradictory assurances which were being given to Palestinians in private at the same time as they were being given to the Israelis, again an interesting history for us, but not an entirely honorable one." Bassam Tibi and others draw a direct link between the history of the contradicting promises during World War I and the fact that the Middle East, perhaps like no other region in the world, is so open to conspiracy theories. The common sentiment is that there is always a hidden agenda, also several hidden agendas, behind the officially proclaimed one. And if these theories contradict each other, they do not become less credible, perhaps even the contrary. Today, in the face of the advance of Daesh, the region abounds with them. The Islamic State proclaims a war against the Crusader, Zionist, Safavid coalition, Safavid, of course, Iran, huh? And many Arab and Iranian Shiites are convinced that the same Islamic State is a joint venture of the Israeli Mossad with the Saudi king to fight the Shiites. Many Sunnis think it is a US-Israeli invention which gives them the pretext of a war against the Sunnis. And again, others think it is a project to create the Kurdish state, which was denied to the Kurds after 1918, to complete the World War I mission of dividing and weakening the Middle East. In my presentation, I can look only into the first years of Iraq and Syria, and my focus will be on Iraq. In November 1918, to say a few words about Syria, the Anglo-French declaration still pledged that the UK and France would, quote, assist in the establishment of indigenous governments and administrations in Syria and Mesopotamia. But despite all reassurances, the French had already decided to rule Syria directly. Both France and Great Britain proceeded to implement their ideas even before the Council of the new League of Nations approved their mandates. And after an ultimatum to the Arab Syrian government, the French, as you know, intervened militarily and defeated the Arabs at the Battle of Maysalun in July 1920. They deposed the Arab government and in August removed King Faisal, the son of Hussein, from Damascus. The dream of a big unified Arab state, or even of a greater Syria, which the 1919 King Crane Commission had reported as the wish of the people, was frustrated. But even Syria and its French mandate borders did not really get a chance. France's obligation, according to the duties of a mandatory, as stipulated by the League of Nations, was to render administrative advice, again a quote, and administrative advice and assistance until such time as those states are able to stand alone. France had to guide Syria on its way to be accepted as an independent member of the League of Nations. Instead, the mandatory was caught in fighting Arab nationalism and as a countermeasure fostered ethnical and sectarian divisions. One old trick was and is a geographical division, granting the minorities, especially in this case the heterodox sect of the Alawites, special autonomous forms of administrations. The rise of the Alawis in the ranks of the Syrian military was a late consequence of French divide et impera policies in Syria. Today, Daesh and even less radical Sunnis see the Assad family with its Alawi roots as an instrument of the imperial West. In Iraq, the British, who at the outset of the war still thought of annexing Basra and establishing a protectorate over Baghdad, had understood that British rule had to be justified on different grounds than just the right of conquest. But it took some time after the war until everybody accepted what Sykes wrote in 1918, namely that, quote, imperialism, annexation, military triumph, prestige, white man's burden were expunged from the popular political vocabulary. The British had decided to go it slowly. Who said it? It was Arnold Wilson, who was civil commissioner in Iraq at that time. Go it slowly with the Arab participation in governing the country, and the revolt, of course, was the result. One element of British rule was the revision of the Ottoman tribal policy, which had aimed at weakening tribal leaders and bringing tribes under government control. The British did exactly the contrary. They made tribal sheikhs, but of course only tribal sheikhs of their liking, stronger, with even a separate penal code for tribes, the infamous Tribal Criminal and Civil Disputes Regulation, which granted judicial authority to tribal leaders. It's interesting that Saddam Hussein did a similar thing 70 years later. Using the sheikhs helped to reduce British personnel costs, but it certainly did not help the social cohesion of the new state. After 2003, the US first worked mainly with Shiites and Kurds and used Arab Sunni sheikhs only later against Al-Qaeda after 2005. Also, the king of Iraq was a British invention, Faisal, who had to be compensated for the loss of Damascus. Nevertheless, he duly started soon to struggle for greater power and autonomy. But there were losers too. The Shiites did not get the dividends of their involvement in the revolt, and although already a majority in the country never got on board of the new state. A disillusioned Faisal deplored in his famous memorandum of 1932 that there is no Iraqi people in Iraq, and depicted a Sunni-governed state with an alienated religious majority, the Shia, and also not happy ethnic minority, the Kurds. Iraqis did not grow together, obviously. After the end of the monarchy in 1958, they would break up mainly along political lines, nationalists and against communists. And after the disappearance of the big ideologies and the breakdown of the Iraqi state during the 1990s due to the UN sanctions and the chaos after the invasion of 2003, they resorted to their sectarian, ethnical, and tribal affiliations. The abrogation of the mandate was a key demand of Faisal and Iraqi politicians at that time. Already in 1922, the British government, also under domestic political pressure, entered a treaty relationship with Iraq. Iraq had to pay half of the costs of the British residency, with obvious consequences for the economic development of the country. When Iraq in 1932 entered the League of Nations, it did so as a de jure independent and self-determined nation state. The reality, however, was quite different. Iraq was ruled by a small clique of mainly Sunni politicians who depended completely on the British and on British support. The state, in fact, did fulfill only one of the 5 criteria for independence formulated by the League, which was having a settled government and an administration operating essential services. Iraq was a quasi-state, as Dobby Dodge calls it. Also, Mosul was given to Iraq practically on false grounds. The League of Nations Commission, which in 1925 was sent as fact-finding mission, attested some progress, but also the overall instability of Iraq. For adding Mosul to the young state, it recommended to the League to put conditions, a long mandatory relationship between Iraq and UK, necessary for the consolidation of the state. And the British at that time agreed to 25 years, and it would become only 7 years. They wanted Mosul badly for Iraq as reinforcement of the Sunni sector in the Iraqi society, and of course because of the oil. It would be a presentation of its own to describe how oil interacted with the changing international political economy and shaped new justifications for Western control and intervention in the Middle East. Equally, the commitments of the US towards Iraq after 2003 were downgraded step by step. At the beginning, the aim was the establishment of a sound, secure, and friendly democracy. At the end, Washington would have been glad to leave a decently stable Iraq, quote, which can defend itself and is not a danger to its neighbors. This was not to be. The Iraqi state could and cannot fulfill the functions of the state in a moment. Coercion of power, defense of the borders, provision of infrastructure, and last but not least, of legitimacy in the eyes of almost all its inhabitants. I recommend to you Hannah Bartato's picturesque description of the political violence in Mosul in 1959, which shows very clearly how in situation of conflict, every possible fault line in such a split society breaks open. At the end, everybody is fighting everybody. I mean, it starts as a battle between communists and nationalists, and it develops into sects fighting sects, ethnicities, tribes, families, social classes, also this is a very important factor, urban and rural people, even town quarters and streets. And it was then, and it is now, difficult to recognize, less comprehend all level of conflicts in such situations. 55 years after those events, a part of Arab Sunnis in Mosul decided that they would fare better if they linked their fate to the absurd organization of the so-called Islamic State, rather than stay with the Iraqi state and its central government, which they did not consider anymore their own. Daesh, in fact, is fought by a mixture of forces which looks like anything but not the army of a regular state. Regrouped Iraqi troops, of course, Kurdish Peshmergas, autonomous Shiite militias, tribal forces, Iranian advisors, and of course airstrikes by a US-led coalition, which also includes Arab Sunni states. Also, if Daesh is defeated, the trust of the Sunnis into the state will not be automatically restored. The former masters of that state have disowned it, at least partly. The US intervention of 2003 changed the strategic balance of the region completely. In the eyes of many Sunni Arabs, Iraq, which in a way was held in the Sunni Arab orbit by the Tigriti Saddam Hussein, shifted to a different identity, from a Sunni Arab to an Iraqi Shiite identity. Mind you, not I am saying this. This is a certain view from some Gulf countries. It's not anymore the same state. And I think really Daesh partly is also a materialization of Sunni fears and an attempt to reverse the new facts. The danger of regional contagiousness is obvious. In Jordan, a poll of autumn 2014 shows that 38% of the population do not consider Daesh a terrorist organization, And not few of those who do consider it a terrorist organization think that it has been created by the US. The attractiveness of Daesh cannot be explained on religious grounds. Also, if the fight against Shiites, Christians, and not recognized religious communities might attract some radicals. But the Muslims of Jordan do not have any misgivings about their religious identity. It is the state which suffers from a lack of legitimacy in the eyes of some. Certainly, this was not caused by the founding history alone, as I said, but also by later shortcomings of the state. But the narrative that this state has to be annihilated because it was a strange creation from outside by crusaders is obviously appealing to some. The belief that the home state, the Watan, is only a step to something bigger was instilled to the population of the region by Arab nationalism. The founding fathers being deeply convinced that the creation of the Arab states was an imperialist project. I mentioned it already. However, the super legitimacy of one single Arab nation state is not available anymore. What is waiting behind the facade of a multiplicity of sovereign states, which are, again a quote, deviant and transient entities, their frontiers illusory and permeable, their rulers interim caretakers or obstacles to removed, as Walid Khalidi wrote. After the unfulfilled dreams of political unity came Nasser's postulate of Arab solidarity, which, however, did not defeat Israel in 1967. The Arab defeat instead boosted the rise of political Islam, and the last illusion started to crumble in 1990 after Saddam Hussein's invasion of neighboring Kuwait, followed by a US-led war against Iraq with Arab participation. The death blow came with the revolts of 2011, which led to the suspension of Syria, the cradle of Arab nationalism, as a member of the Arab League. And all of a sudden, an offer comes around, which is called Islamic, and it's called state, indigenously created and not from outside, politically genuine and culturally authentic. I mean, for those who believe in it. But I am sure that an organization like Daesh can succeed only if the ground is prepared. And there are many different factors who contributed to that. But even if the rise of Daesh certainly is multi-causal, the preparation started 100 years ago. Thank you for your attention.